Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Joshua Martin, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. The Republic of Somaliland is a breakaway region of Somalia which has enjoyed de facto independence since it declared itself a sovereign state in 1991. In contrast to the rest of the country, it has been praised for its multi-party democracy and relatively robust state institutions, although its efforts seeking formal international recognition have thus far been unsuccessful. Earlier this year, however, Somaliland's relative peace was disrupted by fighting in the city of Lede. I'm joined today by James Barnett, the journalist, writer and Fulbright researcher affiliated with the University of Lagos and the Centre for Democracy and Development in Abuja, Nigeria. He has reported from conflict zones in Nigeria, Ukraine and most recently Somalia. For his latest article in New Lines, Inside the Newest Conflict in Somalia's Long Civil War, he travelled to the city of Lede, where a popular uprising against the Somaliland government erupted into open warfare this February. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Josh.
So I wanted to start with something that one of your sources said to you near the end of the article. He said that you shouldn't be ashamed of being a coward under gunfire because it meant that you were, his words, civilized. And he said, gunshots mean nothing to me. I am an animal. That can't be an easy thing to feel about oneself, and certainly not to admit that you're feeling to somebody else.
Yeah, it was pretty devastating to hear, honestly, and I can't imagine what it was like for him to say it. I'm grateful that, we discussed it, and he said, if I could kind of mention that in the article, because it was in some ways a fitting kind of conclusion to this story about, how ordinary Somalis experience trauma. I mean, for the record, this is clear in the story, but I mean, this is one of the smartest kind of contacts I spoke to in Somalia, a young man with real political kind of acumen and kind of insights, someone who really was very kind of honest about the challenges of state building in Somalia, the kind of the issues of clan violence. So like a very, he was an advocate, he's an activist kind of supporting this SSC rebel movement, but, also a very kind of sharp political analyst in his own right. And we'd experienced, a number of kind of firefights together. And at one point, I think out of frustration with just kind of the status of, the Somali political impasse and such, and the length that the civil war has gone on, he kind of opened up about that, about what it means for, someone his age, he's, kind of late 20s, early 30s, to have kind of grown up their whole life, in a conflict environment, and what that does to, psychologically to people. So that's one element of this story, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting that he asked you specifically to mention that, actually. I take it you kind of got the sense that this was something very important to him, this idea of these ordinary civilians experiencing these things.
Yeah. I mean, he'd mentioned it throughout the, throughout our time together, that, the trauma of ordinary Somalis is something that, needed to get more attention. That's something to write about. And, sometimes at first I thought maybe he was kind of joking. He kind of said it in a joking manner, but, later it seemed that he was quite serious about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, was that something that you heard from anyone else, or that kind of attitude?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that, Somalia has been in one form of civil war or another for about 30 years. And so you hear it in Mogadishu, you hear it in southern Somalia, you hear it in Puntland, you hear it all over the country, that there's a degree of, that there's kind of, especially those who have, really been in the heat of it for a long time, or those who grew up in the refugee camps, outside Somalia, that there's kind of this risk that politics is becoming, just this language of violence, because it's what people understand. People are inured to it. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and I didn't have time to or space to unpack everything. There's, it's interesting to contrast, not from this source, but from other sources. Sometimes you'd hear kind of, more like when I was in Mogadishu, you'd hear kind of people complaining about the diaspora, saying, well, they weren't here during the heat of the fighting. Those of us who are here, we kind of were programmed a different way almost. So it comes up in conversation, in one form of conversation, one way or another, I think, throughout the country, not only in Lede.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to what the core question that you were trying to answer with this piece was, which was that, what does it take to build a new society when the task rests on the shoulders of a generation so desensitized to war? And That's kind of what I was hoping to unpack with you a bit today. But before we do, I think we should probably talk a bit to catch the listeners up about how so many Somalis became accustomed to war in the first place. So just broadly and briefly, what led Somalia to become this kind of quintessential example of a failed state?
Yeah, I mean, you have to go back to the 1980s. I mean, I'm sure, right, as with any historian, you can always say, well, it has complex, long roots.
Yeah, you can keep going back hundreds of years, but
right. It's the Tom Friedman approach of start everything in the biblical era when talking about this part of the world. No, I mean, I think that it really goes back. The catalyst was this civil war that broke out in the 1980s. It broke out, there were multiple factors behind the civil war, multiple grievances. There was a strong geopolitical dimension. Somalia had kind of been part of this, the geopolitical proxy competition, whatever you want to call it, in the Horn of Africa during the Civil War. And so, they'd been originally kind of in the Soviet camp, then in the US camp, fought this very disastrous war against Ethiopia, kind of based on these Somali irredentist claims. And so after that, the failure of that kind of war with Ethiopia, the state really started to crumble. And you had different rebel groups kind of cropping up along clan lines. And so by 1991, Siad Barre, that was the dictator, was forced into exile. So he left, and kind of at that point, people say, 91 is, I guess, when, the last semblance of a Somali government for some time disappeared. And so then it was kind of the true failed state at that point. And you had, for really a decade kind of, or if not more, a period of really fierce civil war between these kind of clan-based militias and these individual warlords and stuff. The alliances shifted quite a lot. This is the period in which I think Americans probably first heard about Somalia for many of them, because you had this UN intervention that was backed by and supported by the US military to essentially not kind of like the state building efforts of Iraq and Afghanistan, but a more limited objective of essentially securing a beachhead for humanitarian aid in Somalia. But then gradually there was an element of mission creep. The US military became very interested in hunting this one particularly notorious warlord in Mogadishu. And so then that, resulted in the Black Hawk Down incident, this, very intense battle in Mogadishu. And then after that, the US and kind of UN withdrew. And so Somalia was left to its own devices. Things started to shift a bit in some ways, but not in every way in the 2000s, where you had, the growth of Al-Shabaab, this jihadist group, kind of with pretty substantial links to Al-Qaeda from early on. And then from 2012 onwards, they publicly pledged, an oath of, a bay'ah. So now they're now, Al-Qaeda's East African affiliate. So the war kind of, the civil war in Somalia was kind of transformed into this element of the global war on terror. And there became a very strong regional dimension, particularly with neighboring Ethiopia invading, backed by U.S. forces at the end of 2006. Then by 2011, you had Kenya also intervening in Somalia. Then eventually this kind of African Union peacekeeping force. So It's been this, and at the same time, you've had, since 2006, or maybe it's better to, kind of paint this more as like 2012, after Mogadishu was more or less fully cleared of Al-Shabaab, although they still conduct attacks every day, but they no longer hold, the city in a kind of conventional military sense. You've had you've had a federal government of Somalia that has been, it's had a seat in Mogadishu and stuff. So there is some semblance of statehood, but the remit of the government is so weak. It's very limited. They have trouble even obviously in kind of providing security within most districts of Mogadishu. They're heavily reliant on, the foreign African Union troops. And then what you have is this kind of dynamic where the government in Mogadishu doesn't have much kind of direct power or kind of presence in most of the rest of the country. You have these federal member states, so one of them being Puntland, which is a very, important kind of actor in this story. And these federal member states, they're often not on good terms with the government. They accuse the federal government of meddling in their affairs. So they have autonomy. Some of the states are more autonomous than others. But, needless to say, what this kind of produces is a situation in which the kind of the sources of legitimate state authority are very kind of scant in many areas. And really, even though there's a veneer of kind of statehood or state authority, a lot of it is essentially clan politics and, clan elders or clan leaders that are kind of, almost grassroots kind of building up their own institutions, but with the veneer of kind of statehood.
One of these states that you're talking about is Somaliland, which on the whole has managed to avoid a lot of the worst of the fighting. I think that's fair to say so far. And it's kind of new, right, for this fighting to come to Somaliland rather than the south of the country where there's a lot more of it. And so I was just wondering whether you could talk a little bit about how that came about, that this sort of what's usually, I guess, presented in the media, at least in sort of contrast to the rest of the country, as this island of stability. Was that ever really that true, or has something changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly contentious topic, and you don't make any friends trying to kind of, be balanced on this, I think, because people, obviously, Somalis feel very strongly one way or another, about this question. I think, Somaliland was pretty tumultuous in the 1990s. They were having their own issues. I think it's really been more in the past, in kind of in the 21st century that the country has made some progress. I think a lot, the kind of from 2002 onwards and then really in the past 10 years that they've kind of made more of an international push for kind of recognition and things have been kind of going better there. The issue, I mean, there are a couple issues, right? So like this fighting between Somaliland and the Dulbahante clan, this SSC movement that I was, kind of spent some time with, there had been similar clashes in the early 2010s. So it wasn't like this was the first instance. And, over the past couple of years, there's been some concerns in Somaliland about democratic backsliding, about, some of the kind of the consensus between the clans breaking down, right? And so some of the Western kind of institutions that the Somaliland built on top of, within their new state, they still kind of had to be built on a consensus between the powerful clans, because at the end of the day, the clan is still the fundamental socio-political unit, I would say, not only of Somalia, but of Somaliland. And so it's very, you can only build up these institutions when you have that consensus between those, fundamental socio-political units. And I think that in recent years, we've seen that started to degrade a bit. So maybe, in some ways, and of course the Somaliland government would, disagree with this, but, my own assessment is that maybe, things already kind of peaked. And what we've seen in the past couple of years is that the social fabric and the consensus has been decreasing a bit. And so that's how you could potentially get something like the situation in Las Anod. There, though, it's complicated where the region, you essentially have kind of the core of Somaliland, which is the area around like Hargeisa and some of these other cities, Berbera, that's predominantly dominated by the Isak clan. And there was really strong, kind of interest in independence. And, as they point out, they had been an independent state for several days before they voluntarily joined with Somalia in 1960, right after, decolonization. So to them, they don't see it as kind of succeeding. They see it as reclaiming their mandate, kind of that they see that the union doesn't work anymore. So we're going back. So you'd had, real strong support for that over there. But the thing is that in order kind of the claim to statehood that the Somaliland government puts out is premised to a large extent on these colonial era borders. And the colonial era borders, essentially the division between the British and then the Italian colony, which later became a UN trusteeship, that cuts through some territory of some clans, particularly the Dulbahante and the Warsangeli clans, that were never kind of fully as on board with secessionism or with the kind of Somaliland independence. And there's even some, issues between those clans and the Isak of Somaliland that go back well over a century. So there always kind of been this weird kind of disputed land in between what you could say the core of Somaliland and then the federal member state of Puntland, which is highly autonomous, but has never, declared independence from Somalia. So that area, which is, the area where I spent this time and did this reporting, has kind of changed hands multiple times since 1991. And for a time, it was administered by, the kind of the Dulbahante elders were aligned with Puntland. So they said, okay, we're part of Puntland. Some faction of the Dulbahante didn't want to be part of Puntland. They wanted to be their own state. But essentially what happened was that in 2007, political infighting within Puntland meant that the Somalilanders kind of government had an opportunity to, send troops into Las Anod and some other areas and then enforce what it believed was its kind of its sovereignty, right? Because it believed we're declaring independence as a state that has a border, This border was agreed to in 1960, even if it was drawn by the British and the Italians. We agreed to it upon independence. And so we're just coming to kind of reclaim the territory that's within our border. The problem, though, and then there were years where there was always kind of a hard line. Certain Dulbahante were very opposed to Somaliland, but there was also a lot of divisions within the Dulbahante, within the people who would make up the SSC. So there was kind of this, there was this ambiguous period for a while, I think, where, some of the Dulbahante kind of sided with Puntland and said, well, no, we're part of Somalia, so we're part of Puntland. And so they went on and they had political careers in Puntland. Others sided more with Somaliland. So the community was itself kind of divided. What changed and what was the catalyst for this uprising was, that I think in the past couple of years, local people in Las Anod started to feel that Somaliland was ruling with a bit of a heavier hand. One of the real catalysts was these kind of the killings and disappearances of, some prominent kind of civil society leaders and politicians and stuff in Las Anod and surrounding areas that were either kind of affiliated with Dulbahante nationalism or were part of the political opposition within Somaliland. And so what happened was that, these kind of killings started increasing. The locals blamed the Somaliland government. The Somaliland government, of course, denied any involvement, but needless to say, the trust was broken. And so after one killing in December of last year, a lot of people, they got fed up. There was this kind of popular uprising among, a large segment of the city, it seems. And then you had, that kind of escalated very quickly into this broader conflict, with the kind of Dulbahante militias and other, militias from the region on one side, and then the Isak, dominated Somaliland military on the other.
It seems like a bit of a dangerous game for Somaliland to be governing with such a heavy hand in the first place, given, like you say, it's a place that's changed hands a lot of times. Did they just overestimate how secure they were in their position there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a large extent that seems to be what happened. Like I said, there was real kind of consensus for the Somaliland project in much of the Somaliland territory, but this was an area where the population had never been kind of fully on board, it seems. One of the things to keep in mind is that in all sides, right, among all the clans in both Somaliland and Somalia, like, there are always political opportunists. And so this is where it kind of gets tough as an outside observer, because someone will say one thing today, but then you saw that, a year or two ago, they were working with, one government or another. So, but that's just human nature, and that's just politics, right? That's not something I think unique to Somalia. But I think, from what I can tell, it does seem like Somaliland was probably playing a risky bet here, because the population had never been fully on board with the kind of Somaliland project as they had in, say, more so in Hargeisa. On the other hand, for a lot of regimes in this part of the world and elsewhere, suppressing dissent is easier than tolerating it, at least for a time. So it's a way, eventually it probably creates blowback and explodes in your face, like it has for Somaliland, I think. But, for a time, I mean, Somaliland did occupy the city for 15 years. And that was through a combination, and it usually is a combination of co-optation and coercion, right? It's in these kind of less than democratic situations, if you will, there's an element of kind of, the authorities co-opt some prominent members of society. So there's just enough buy-in to keep things going, but then they're also coercing or repressing the elements of society that are pushing for, they're agitating for change one way or another. Yeah, but I mean, I think what we saw is that the Somaliland policy, backfired last year and, started this year.
So I would like to come back to Somaliland in a moment, but first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the SSC, this militia that's fighting them. Could you talk about who they are, how they came about? I mean, you talk about them and the Dulbahante, almost like they're synonyms. Is that reasonably accurate to say?
Yes and no. I mean, this is where the kind of the political ambiguity of the project comes in. For the moment, the SSC is much more than just a Dulbahante affair. So the SSC, that stands for Sulsana Ganain, which are the territories that the Dulbahante would like to kind of claim as their own land, right? So this is essentially this is a movement. There had been earlier iterations of it, but when this protest started in Las Anod, they kind of this is the movement that kind of emerged and kind of took control and has been kind of waging this insurgency against the Somaliland government. with a lot of popular support, it seems, in the area to break away from Somaliland. So the SSC, they're kind of what they've outlined in their political project is that, their main goal right now is to break away these lands from Somaliland and to rejoin or to be recognized once again as part of the Somali federal government as kind of this, this autonomous region for the next 2-year period. Then after that 2-year period, their goal is they want to become a federal member state, similar to what, the status that Puntland has. So this is a really key element to all of this, which is that the SSC, even though those lands were kind of claimed by both Puntland and Somaliland, they don't want to be part of either. They want to create their own state, is what they're saying. What's interesting, though, is that, even though the core leadership of the movement is Dulbahante, and then there's a smaller clan kind of closely affiliated with the Dulbahante that's helping them, but they're also getting support now from these 2 other clans in the broader Harti clan family. So these are the Worsengeli clan and then the Majertain. And the Majertain are the ones who are, they're kind of like the politically dominant clan in Puntland. So as I kind of talk about in the article, right now there's this kind of unity among these 3 big clans, if you will, to kind of allow the SSC project to, to move ahead and to try to kind of establish that state, where I think things get much, where there's less certainty and probably more disagreement within the SSC is what are the exact contours of this state going to look like? Based on my interviews with different members, both of kind of the elders who constituted the leadership council when I was there, as well as activists, members from the diaspora, local residents, some people saw this as our goal is predominantly to create a state for the Dulbahante. That's what we're agitating for, and we appreciate the support of these other clans. But those other clans will have their own states and their own space. Right now, we're fighting for our own state. Whereas others kind of had this view that, well, the SSC will be more than just a Dulbahante. It'll be more than just a Dulbahante state. It will also have Worsengeli, and some even said Majertain. And when you bring in the Majertain, it gets very weird because the Majertain already effectively have their state in Puntland. So does that mean that there's going to be, tension between the SSC and Puntland over the exact borders and stuff? So that's where I think that at present you have this kind of unity of purpose against Somaliland. But the question is kind of what comes next, assuming these guys are successful and, they've been holding out for a long time. The Somaliland, they're having some troubles over closer to Hargeisa now. So the SSC people that I'm still in touch with in the months since the weeks since I left, they're very optimistic that that the Somaliland forces will eventually withdraw. And as I, told the elders, the leaders of this movement when I was there in June, I said, look, I don't have a dog in this fight. You guys really might get your autonomy from Somaliland. Good for you. The question is, what are you going to do next? You haven't been able to kind of articulate what are the exact contours of this state. What's your relationship going to be with Puntland? What's your relationship going to be like with the federal government? So that's where some of the discussion in the essay about this isn't unique to the SSC. This isn't even a particular issue of kind of a shortcoming of the movement. It's a broader issue in Somalia about how do you build a state based on these clan identities that are very kind of volatile and always shifting and such.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit more about the clans, because you call it in your piece, I think, the fundamental socio-political unit of the nation. But so far, we've not been very clear exactly how the sort of clan system works. How does it all sort of work in terms of governance and alliances and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, so, it's somewhat complex insofar as, for starters, it's a very multi-layered system, right? Where Somalis, like in Mogadishu, people will talk about the 4.5 system, by which they mean the 4 major clans, so this is how they've kind of allotted seats in the federal government and stuff. You have, a division between the 4 major clans and then half a division, like half an allotment for all of these smaller clans. But the problem is that a lot of those bigger major clans, like to even call them a clan is maybe a bit misleading because it's so large. It encompasses so many of these smaller units. So when you ask a Somali, what clan do you belong to? Depending on the context, they might say, I'm Darod, which is the highest level. That's one of the 4.5, one of the biggest clans in Somalia. Or they could say, well, I'm Harti, which is, a subdivision of that. Or they could say, well, I'm Dulbahante, which is a subdivision of the Harti. But then there are all these subdivisions of the Dulbahante. So it kind of, in the political context, I think what this kind of creates is, in Mogadishu politics, a lot of stuff is talked about in terms of, the big clan units, the 4.5 stuff. But once you get to the local level in places like Puntland, places like, Jubaland, where I also did some research before going to Las Anod, then you have a lot of these kind of the distinctions and the differences between the different constituent clans of those larger clan groups really come into play. So that's just kind of on the question of the identity. On the question of the leadership, I mean, that's not an area that I'm an expert in. I would caveat. I think that, generally you have kind of, clan elders that are either based on their lineage or based on some kind of consultative, somewhat democratic system, are essentially seen as like, and treated as being the representatives of that clan. So Somalia for the past, since 2012, I guess, they've not been able to hold, proper like one person, one vote elections because of the insecurity, because Al-Shabaab controls, a sizable chunk of the country and the population. So what they've done is essentially, clan elders from different clans around the country come to Mogadishu and vote on behalf of their clan. And it's certainly, a less than ideal system. And you get into, every time around the election season, you get into these debates and sometimes these violent conflicts about, well, who's allowed to represent this clan? Because, of course, the president and his party are going to say, they're going to pick one member of that clan who's aligned with them and say, oh, he's your clan elder. But then some other people might say, no, we don't recognize that guy as our clan elder. He's just a political stooge. So the whole thing becomes very politicized in a way that it becomes difficult. You can't really talk about clan identity and clan leadership and structure as if it's some kind of unchanging, tradition that, the Somalis have always had, because it's changed with, the political winds so much throughout history.
Right. And so would it be fair then to say, I guess, that that's part of the problem that Somalia has had, particularly since the 1980s, is that it's failed to synthesize the clan system with the nation state system. There's these two systems and it hasn't found a way of mixing them together that functions very well. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, that's insofar as, I think the fundamental problem, right, going down, looking at the Al-Shabaab conflict, which is more in southern Somalia than the north. And that's, that's what I actually did most of my kind of research on when I was in Somalia and writing a report on that now. I mean, the fundamental issue there is politics, right? Like Al-Shabaab only thrives because the different, kind of political entities, which, as I said, these days are essentially drawn along clan lines, but also with very strong personalities kind of representing those different groups, if you will, that there's, they can't agree on the division of resources. They can't agree on the division of political power, on representation and stuff like that. So in some ways, yes, it is a question of kind of, fitting the clan system into the modern nation state system. But I would say, yeah, I mean, there are also a lot of other elements at play, right? So like I said, there's been this element of kind of the presence of foreign military forces in the country, particularly the Ethiopian role, has been very controversial historically. There is, a genuine kind of ideological contest going on between, Al-Shabaab's interpretation of Islam and the ones that have traditionally been stronger in Somalia. So it's, it's multifactorial, if you will. But fundamentally, I think that Somalia's challenge is not a social one, it's a political one. And I think at this moment, the politics are kind of built around these clan identities. So yeah, in a sense.
Okay, that's interesting, because the reason I bring that up is because I often see Somaliland being hailed as a contrast, right? This big success story in comparison to Somalia's failed state. You'll see people contrast the top-down, quote-unquote, approach of the national government to the south with Somaliland's bottom-up approach. The idea is that it's, successfully combined clan traditions with a state apparatus, kind of a hybrid system. Having been on the ground and seen it, particularly at this point where there's a conflict erupting right on its border, has this kind of been overemphasized, would you say?
I mean, yeah, it certainly has, insofar as Somaliland never clearly enjoyed the same degree of consensus across the full breadth of the colonial protectorate as it once had. I'm in a position where I tried to go to Hargeisa. I wanted to go. And, after spending time with the SSC, I'm effectively PNG'd, which is, that's expected, yeah. Right? Yeah, I'm not surprised or shocked or even offended. It's, that's life. So I can't really speak much to what the situation looks like in Hargeisa, kind of based on, the SSC, of course, are of this view that, Somaliland is this fake state, that it never had any consensus or whatever. And they point to one of the, just recently in the past 2 months, there's been some serious opposition from one kind of subclan of the Isak that's now turned into essentially a violent conflict. So, they'll point to that and say, there's never any consensus anywhere. But I mean, from what I've read about this, from what I've looked at, I think that there was more kind of political progress in again, the western part of Somaliland, Hargeisa, Berbera and stuff, where there was kind of that consensus between the clans did allow for them to build up some, institutions that they haven't enjoyed in southern Somalia. I mean, just, the element of one person, one vote, right? That they've had elections like that in Somaliland for some time and they haven't in Somalia. So I think that there is some truth to that. A lot of analysts also, but, it's never been as complete as, I guess, what I would say. And particularly, there's always been a very big geographic disparity between, how the Somaliland state building project is perceived in one part of the region as opposed to another. A number of people have also, analysts have pointed particularly to kind of, Musa Bihi, the current president. There's been an issue as well where there's been this kind of a de facto extension of his term. And, they give a very technical reason based on the system of how the elections run and parties have to be registered and re-registered. But, certainly a lot of Somalilanders themselves, including, Isak, members of the opposition and stuff, also feel that that part of this is a recent problem as a result of, one kind of, one political party essentially, rather than, so there are many Somalilanders, I think, who are critical of the current government maybe, but don't want to throw out the entire Somaliland state building project. But as I said, I mean, I think with this issue in Las Anod, it kind of seemed to me like it was going to be, you get access from one side or not the other. I think that's often how it is in these conflicts. And so I should be, kind of humble in my own assessment of what's happening in Hargeisa.
So when we're talking about sort of Somaliland state building project, a lot of its success there is its ability to, or its perceived ability to maintain peace within the territory it controls. I mean, its anthem instructs its people to, and I quote here, live in eternal peace, live in eternal peace, we greet you with joy, live in eternal peace. I mean, that's pretty clear, right? That's a big part of the pit. You live in Somaliland and you avoid warfare. Given the outbreak of fighting in Las Anod, those words are probably starting to sound a bit hollow, right? Do you think the Somaliland project can sustain itself if the conflict continues for, 2 years, 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. Maybe I should kind of try to put on my realist cap, if you will. Somaliland's pitch for independence, its kind of arguments that it's made and, to both US, Europe, the Gulf states, regional actors, it's been very engaged in that kind of diplomatic effort. There are multiple elements to it, right? There's the selling point of democracy. There's the selling point of stability. There's also, to certain powers, especially the selling point of just kind of geography and the benefits, right? Somaliland has a very strategic coastline in that, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, Gulf of Aden region. I think that, if we're being realistic, certain external actors are going to be happy to continue working with Somaliland, regardless of kind of its democratic credentials. I think that the democratic kind of backsliding and, this conflict hurts Somaliland more in its engagements with the US and the EU. And we've seen a bit of that there has been a kind of de facto and quiet downgrading of ties, insofar as some of the embassies in Mogadishu that had previously been, sending people to Hargeisa a lot, kind of stopped doing it as much at the start of the conflict. So I think that this conflict is a liability for them, because I think that even if you kind of assume, all right, we put on our realist cap here, this is the Horn of Africa, there's no real democratic state in the region. So maybe you can kind of, maybe the Somaliland government can get away with, a bit of the democratic backsliding, but that only works if, it can also maintain its stability. Again, just speaking as, kind of realpolitik here. And so the Las Anod conflict in that sense really is going to be a challenge in that regard, because there, and especially it's not just the city itself of Las Anod, it's some of the surrounding terrain. If this is a state that doesn't have full control over, the mandate that it claims, full control over its territory, then, that is definitely, I think, going to cause some skepticism from international observers and different foreign governments about, okay, how viable is this? I think that the real question is this kind of, there's been some clan violence, recently, as I said, just kind of starting a couple months ago and escalating a couple weeks ago, much closer to Hargeisa, just south, kind of in the Isak lands. I don't really know much about that. That's not an area I've kind of analyzed the local dynamics. I just know kind of in broad terms that the kind of militia there is linked to one opposition figure maybe, and they're kind of saying that this is about Musabihi and the election delays. But, if there's continued violence in that part of Somaliland combined with what's happening in Las Anod, then that's a major challenge for Somaliland. The Las Anod conflict on itself, I think, especially because Somaliland is putting a lot of security resources into that, soldiers, weapons, stuff like that, that I think that the longer that conflict goes on, it really does kind of drain Somaliland's resources and stuff. But, we'll see. Unfortunately, the Horn of Africa has, seen more than one frozen conflict in its days. So I don't think that we should assume that this will be resolved kind of immediately. It could potentially drag on for a while. The SSC folks are quite optimistic that I talked to. So maybe the Somaliland side will really crack, but I also wouldn't rule out that this will drag on for quite some time further.
And that was where things stood at the time of recording. But just days after I caught up with James, the situation changed rapidly, and we agreed to meet a second time to talk about what it meant. James, thanks for being here. What's changed since we last spoke?
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. So essentially on August 25th, the entire kind of battlefield situation changed really overnight. I mean, in the span of a day. The conflict, as I wrote, in the essay for New Lines, both when I was there in June and in the weeks following the publication of the article, the situation was really quite stalemated on the ground, where essentially you had the Somaliland lines encircling roughly three sides of Las Anod, and then the SSC fighters in the town and in some positions also outside the town, kind of encircling in Somaliland forces in a way. There were kind of multiple layers of overlapping lines, but everything was pretty stalemated, right? They were just fighting, shooting back and forth. And then on August 25th, in the span of a day, the SSC overran pretty much all of the Somaliland positions in the territory that they lay claim to. So to put it simply, I mean, this was, I think, just for lack of a better word, it was a military victory. And indeed, the SSC are already kind of claiming victory in this war, right? Because their forces are now in control of pretty much the entirety of the Dulbahante lands, which is the land that they claim for the creation of an autonomous SSC state. The Somaliland forces had to withdraw. They kind of were routed, like I said, in the span of just one day. The situation now, Somaliland has not they've not given up their claim to that territory. So we're very much in a kind of precarious moment where we're waiting to see what will happen next, because kind of, at least rhetorically, politically, these two states are still at war. But the SSC is kind of, they see this as they've essentially won the war against Somaliland, although they're still, preparing for the possibility of a counterattack. But they've had their celebrations. Their administration is moving ahead with its kind of political plans for, the building up of the SSC Khartoum state. And yeah, SSC activists are kind of, declaring August 25th Victory Day. So that was kind of a very surprising development, that even when I got some calls from SSC contacts, the day of, I woke up to the news because I was in the US, and, even some of them were surprised that it had happened so quickly. So I think that kind of speaks to what a shocking development this was in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, they even captured a general, right?
Yeah, they did. They captured, I mean, the numbers that I heard, and of course, these should be taken with a grain of salt, because they're coming from, the one belligerent of the conflict, but, that they captured the commander of the Somaliland forces around Las Anod, as well as about, I think, upwards of 300 other soldiers, a number, several tanks, a lot of technicals, a bunch of, other military vehicles. And it was, it was a bloody kind of series of or at least that day, the fighting on August 25th, which kind of continued into the next day. The ICRC, the Red Cross, has been up there, and I think they've collected several dozen bodies for burial. They won't say, which side they belong to, but the kind of, what everyone is kind of assessing or assuming is that these are mostly Somaliland soldiers who were killed. So it was, within the context of this conflict, it was a relatively large scale and successful, military offensive.
Yeah, so the SSC are declaring this a victory, but at least publicly, Somaliland has declared its intention to come back and fight again another day. I think the Somaliland Minister of Defense released a statement that said that the National Army was in the midst of a serious reorganization and preparation to confront the enemy.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to say that regardless, but do you think that it seems likely that this will continue?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is I'm kind of wary of making predictions here. I think, it's a very kind of odd situation insofar as I think that the SSC ended up being much more successful in its military campaign than most observers, including many Somalis, who I spoke with in Mogadishu and stuff, than many people expected. I think that, a lot of observers, myself on the ground when I was there, I didn't see, anything that indicated that the SSC was on the verge of victory. It seemed like a very stalemated conflict. So I think, the two things that really changed in kind of the period between when I visited and wrote my article and the end of August, one is that the SSC itself became better organized. And right. You could see this because what happened on August 25th was that they launched a coordinated offensive, and they hadn't been doing that in the past. It's one of the things I discuss in some detail in the article, which is that, right, the SSC was not an army. It was an organization or a coalition of different militias from different subclans that had kind of banded together, and there was no centralized command and control. And so it meant that there was a lot of shooting back and forth across the front line, but there was no real coordinated movement from the SSC forces. And, from what I've heard from contacts, essentially in the course of several weeks in August, when the SSC was kind of organizing a new political body to oversee the administration, that also entailed kind of overseeing a more unified military command. And so they just kind of, they got their act together, so to speak. They acquired some new weapons and technicals as well. They mentioned, through the sources that I discuss in my article. So part of it, all this to say, part of it is that the SSC, at least for the time being, seems better organized and a more competent fighting force than they were for the first 6 months of the conflict. But the other thing that really, I think, changed and has had a serious impact on not just the Somaliland military's ability to fight in Las Anod, but also kind of the overall stability of the country, of Somaliland, is that you have this clan uprising, or kind of, at least disgruntlement and discontent from certain clans within the Isak, within central Somaliland, and in particular the Garhajis clan. And so what we saw in kind of early August was that the elements of the Garhajis clan started fighting with the Somaliland security forces in parts of central Somalia. And then the reports that I heard were that kind of in the days leading up to the SSC offensive, but also on the day of the SSC offensive, the Somaliland army's kind of morale just really broke. And that Garhajis units in particular, this one subclan of the Isak, that a number of them defected. And that notably from what I've heard, and the picture is still a bit muddled, so, take that with these caveats. But from what I heard, the Garhajis did not join the SSC. They just stopped fighting with Somalia because they're not actually aligned with the Dulbahante. They don't, they're also enemies there. Maybe there is something behind the scenes that I'm not aware of, but the reports I heard were actually that Garhajis fighters even ended up fighting with SSC fighters, but they were also fighting with Somaliland fighters. So all this to say that the Somaliland army, I think, underwent a really serious crisis of morale and had some serious defections that are kind of rooted not so much in the SSC Las Anod issue, but more in the kind of the broader kind of political uncertainty and increasing political friction in the country. So, all of that to say, to kind of bring it back to your question, I mean, I think it would be very difficult for Somaliland to militarily retake the SSC lands, the territory that the SSC forces now hold. A lot can change over the coming weeks and months. and years, right? And I think that this is where it's important to look at the history of Las Anod, which the city had been occupied by Dulbahante militias and militias aligned with the Puntland state up until 2007. And in 2007, you had discord between the different clans in Puntland, including the Dulbahante. And so that provided an opportunity for Somaliland to kind of forces to come in and occupy it. And so I think I would not be surprised if, the Somaliland strategy would be, okay, wait and hope that some of these, the internal friction within the SSC or between the SSC and Puntland, that, something like that will lead to kind of a breakdown of the, what we now see as a relatively organized SSC army that, over time, due to the kind of fractious politics of the region that I discuss in the article, that maybe those, those clans will be in conflict with each other. And that's when Somaliland can come in and reassert itself. Because I think that, as we see it now, I don't see how the Somaliland military, and I'm not an expert in their military. I mean, maybe they have some secret assets that I'm not aware of. Maybe they have a deeper pool of manpower that I'm not aware of. But it seems unlikely if they were just kind of barely holding on to Las Anod for 6 months to their positions outside of town, which, the positions were strong because they were in good terrain, right? They had mountains overlooking the town. They could shell the SSC positions in the city from those areas. Now that they've lost that and they've been pushed into their own territories back in kind of, or, the Quarry Sock territories in Somaliland, I think it would be hard for Somaliland to kind of come in and reoccupy those lands. But I think, as we've seen with how abrupt, the SSC's victory was, and in many ways unexpected, I wouldn't rule out anything at this moment, but that's just kind of my impression.
Yeah, and it seems like the dominoes are kind of starting to fall, right? You've got the SSC taking over Las Anod. You've also got fighting with clans elsewhere in Somaliland. I mean, it doesn't look great from the point of view of the Somaliland government right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would think not. And I think that the so-called international community, right, the US, the EU, the UN, have all called for kind of, an immediate stop in what they consider the escalation in fighting, right, which was the SSC, offensive. I mean, they tend to be very kind of ambiguous, diplomatically ambiguous in their statements. So they didn't refer to an SSC offensive, but essentially, the cause of their concern, I think in part, is that, there was some fear that maybe the SSC forces would move in, further into Somaliland and really try to like topple the government or something. And that, all of a sudden you had this question of kind of the long-term stability of Somaliland might be at stake. I think what we've seen in the days since the August 25th offensive is that, the SSC fighters are, the SSC leadership was not interested in kind of crossing into the Quarry Sock territory. I think they realize, for one, I don't think that, they don't consider those places their land in the same way that they consider, the Seoul region to be their land, but also they're not stupid and they know that they have no popular support, that they're very much seen as the enemy in those areas. So I don't think that, I don't think there's a risk of an immediate, the SSC marches on Hargeisa, but you now have this situation, just again, in the eastern part of Somaliland, the conflict is very much not resolved, right? And you have almost a bit of a security dilemma, if you will, where the SSC does not trust Somaliland not to try to come back and reclaim the area by force. So the SSC is reinforcing positions. Their positions in what they consider the Dulbahante lands, they say, we're not moving into Somaliland. And they're even making this clear in their statements. They're not saying we want regime change in Somaliland or anything. They're saying we're not going to enter Somaliland, but they're still reinforcing their military positions in their own territory. And because Somaliland sees that territory as part of their sovereign nation, they certainly have not admitted defeat. They've not said, oh yeah, sure, SSC can go and have its own state. And not only that, but they see that this armed movement that just had this big, successful offensive is still mobilizing its forces. And so maybe they're starting to get worried as well in Hargeisa that the SSC is maybe conspiring with other elements or whatever, and that, maybe a bigger, that the conflict might reignite. So I think, this is, a time where I think that both sides need to kind of be talking clearly with each other to avoid a kind of a reignition of the conflict on a broader level. Because as you say, then from the perspective of Somaliland, it's not just this issue in the east. which, for the time being has been, very much seems to be trending in the direction of the SSC's favor. But it's also that the military defeat is a big blow kind of politically into the prestige and the credibility of the Somaliland government. But there's also, like you say, there's this other clan uprising happening. There's a lot of uncertainty within Somaliland right now. I think that the Somaliland political elite have been quite, relatively unified, actually. You've even had some, a number of opposition figures who are kind of opposed to Musa Bihi, the president, kind of rally around the flag after the SSC victory. So, it's not like the whole kind of house of cards is collapsing or whatever. There still does seem to be, and again, this is my read. I'm not in Somaliland, so I'm not I don't have the best insights there.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, it raises serious questions about, the stability of that country. One concern, again, I would have is that if, with kind of a weakened, or the president's credibility and his administration's credibility having taken a hit, that one of the kind of the last legs that they'll have to stand on is this war. And there's going to be this rally around the flag effect. And so that, maybe the war really isn't over, because maybe the best way for the current administration in Somaliland to survive, and, the best way that many Somalilanders feel that they need to do to save their nation or whatever is to reclaim the SSC territories.
Right.
Then you could have a big problem. So that's why, while I think that at the moment the SSC certainly, they've secured the territory they want, I'd be very cautious about predicting where things go next. I think it's a pretty volatile situation, both, for Somaliland, but also for the kind of nascent SSC, state.
James Barnett, thank you very much. This has been The Lead, a podcast by New Lines Magazine. You can find James Barnett on Twitter at JH_Barnett and read his article, Inside the Newest Conflict in Somalia's Long Civil War, on our website, newlinesmag.com. This week's episode was produced and hosted by me, Joshua Martin. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app. Thank you for joining us.